while I still believe that we are the 70%, that we are the masses, right, that actually believe in truth and in science and in fact, and want diversity, this 30% isn't just 30%, walking around the street handing out pamphlets. They have weaponized social media and media in a way that I don't think that we've ever seen. So when you think about that in conjunction with the 1850s and America's ability to persevere, what do you think that our ability is in this moment, given what we're up against?
So the elite Southern enslavers did, in fact, control the media in the American South. And they controlled it to the point that they simply didn't let any information that might contradict their own worldview from coming in. Quite literally. I mean, you could go to prison if you had, for example, a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, or they simply would not let Northern newspapers circulate. And finally, of course, in the election of 1860, most Southern states didn't even put Abraham Lincoln on the ballot, or his electors on the ballot. So it's not that the media world is necessarily any different right now. What is different is the amplification of that media through the artificial means that you just recognized, something that I really wish our government would take on, not stopping that language, but stopping the artificial amplification of that, which is a different thing than the First Amendment. But the other piece that is, and that worries me less than one would think, because I really do believe at the end of the day, most people are not stupid. What worries me more is that the extremist Republicans, and by that in my opinion, all of the Republicans right now are extremists. They are out of step with what the American people have generally been. But the ones I'm talking about, the Trump Republicans, the MAGA Republicans, it really concerns me the degree to which they have taken power in the states, especially in important, again, nodes of election pieces of the states, where even though they have very small political power, numerically, they've managed to take over critical levers of our democracy. And that worries me a lot more. That being said, when you think about it, how does a political minority of, I would say it's actually probably under 30%, how in the United States, which has had a history of people throwing off the idea of a coercive government, rule over 70%? And I play that out in my head a lot, and we know how other countries have managed that with violence, with state violence, with all sorts of different ways of coercing people. And I have to say, I have a hard time seeing that ultimately succeeding in the United States.
It's interesting you say that, because the examples are afoot all throughout America, right? Like we have Wisconsin. And as of this recording, here's the Wisconsin Republicans using and abusing what power they have to say, oh, yeah, there's this liberal Supreme Court justice. Yeah, we're going to impeach her. Why? Because we can. And then you have Alabama Republicans now punishing women. Should be bigger news. We talked about it in this podcast. Guess what? You want to leave the state to get an abortion? Well, anyone who helps you, it can be held liable as a co-conspirator and get like 10 to 12 years in prison. Florida, for example, let's dilute black voters, and on it goes. Tennessee, 3 lawmakers, especially 2 black men, engaged in a nonviolent protest with the masses against gun violence. We're going to kick you out. And so we're dealing with what I call a radicalized, weaponized minority that now represents the GOP that does not seem beholden whatsoever, Heather, to any norms or democracy. And so this is the flip side of me being hopeful. We have said on this podcast, I've said also, I've written about that, if they can't have power, they're going to burn everything down, including themselves. It will be an act of self-immolation, and even equality to them is subjugation, right? And so I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, from a historian's point of view, you wrote this other great book called How the South Won the Civil War. It came out a couple of years ago, which talks about the mindset that has still permeated America, right? In which we infantilized, rationalized, elevated, romanticized, and excused white supremacy to the point where it still infects us and still dominates us. You take all that into account, and the cynic in me is that we have never really confronted this as a threat that it is. And we've always let this minority beat us in the sense that we're Charlie Brown and they're Lucy. And we say, okay, Lucy, you're not going to lift the football, are you? And Lucy's like, hee, no. And then we run towards the football and the majority falls on its ass. Like, your response to that's the feeling that I have.
Well, so let me start with the idea that I don't disagree with you in the least little bit, that thread, basically you can divide maybe world history, but at least American history up into the fact there's two ways to look at the world. Either everybody should be equal before the law, or some people are better than others and have the right to rule over everybody else. And in both of those strands are very deeply embedded in the United States, for sure. And let me take your position for a minute. One of the things that when people say to me, "Oh, that can't possibly ever happen in the United States, where we have a one-party state that treats people according to different categories, and that people aren't responsible for their actions before the law," my answer to that is always, well, we've already had it. And we've had it really dramatically from about 1874 to 1965, and we've had it in the American South. And I think that's really instructive, that moment, because it didn't last. It lasted for a long time, but there are two things that tore that apart, and a theme over all of them. One is that people who were trying to challenge Jim Crow and challenge the Solid South, as it was known, operated in the courts from the very beginning. I mean, they did not roll over and say, okay, we're going to let this happen. They fought it in the courts. But by 1909, the NAACP also began to call attention to the atrocities that were being committed in the American South and refused to let people look the other way. And then people decided that it was not going to be enough simply to try and fight in the courts. They needed to take to the streets. They needed actually to be out there changing things and bringing attention to what was being done, especially to Black Americans, but also to Indigenous Americans and other brown Americans. So there was an attempt among politically marginalized people or political minorities. I want to make it clear it's not just racial minorities or ethnic minorities, but political minorities in those states, to step up and say, it's our country too. We have a right to be treated equally before the law, and we have a right to have a say in our government. And what happened when they did that was they started being murdered, right? In fairly large numbers. But what's interesting to me about that moment is that those are people who have virtually no power, right? And yet within the space of, say, 1954 to 1965, they completely changed what the United States is all about at a time when really only white men are voting. White women are voting, but they vote with their husbands until 1980. So the idea that we're stuck here and we have to accept what is being imposed on us by a powerful minority has just been proven wrong in the past. And now we have, of course, the benefit of the fact that people of color really can vote. Black people really can vote. Women really can vote. Now, not in the numbers they should be able to. Voter suppression is a very real thing. But I'm not willing yet to say the game's over.